Howdy from Texas. This is Roy Sorensen, and I'll be talking about destigmatizing the exegetical attribution of lies, the case of Kant. The authors are Roy Sorensen and Ian Proops. Ian Proops is on the right there, holding the lead. Wait, I'm not the horse. I'm a human being, and there I am, doing what I do best, thinking. The published basis for the video is an article of the same name. I'm going to be adding illustrations. I'm not going to deprive you of these new things that I have discovered since the article was accepted. The thesis is that the attribution of lying can yield the best interpretation of an author regardless of how strongly he condemns lying. So the strategy is you take someone who is the most extreme opponent of lying, and then you say, well, it still works even for this extreme opponent, and so it'll work for less extreme opponents. Historians privately attribute lies to scholars, but rarely do so publicly. I think they're being polite, perhaps. So I've looked for attributions, and I found one. If you can find others, let me know, but this is the only one I found. A Note on a Curious Lie by Leibniz. And it is kind of an exception to the rule. You will see published stuff where it looks like they're kind of insinuating it, or they're hedged, or remarks, or they use words, euphemisms for lie, like prevarication, disingenuous, insincere, and so forth. Kind of scratch your head and try to figure out what they're talking about. It's kind of odd in analytic philosophy, where you prize your clarity. Why create difficulties for people? Prediction. The obscurity that's introduced by this will diminish as the stigma of lie attribution decreases. I think analytic philosophers, they value clarity. They disagree on quite a bit, but they like clarity. And so they're all disposed to spread their intolerance of euphemism once they see others take the step. So we're taking a step. Now, it would be pretty easy to attribute lies to a scholar if the scholar believed they were obliged to lie. That is, they thought they were doing a good thing. Samantha Frost contends that Thomas Hobbes believes we are obliged to lie to keep the peace. So if you can't just be silent or wiggle out of the interrogation or something, then you may have to tell people what is not true. And the basic idea with Hobbes is that you cannot control what you believe, and that means you'll offend others if you sincerely speak on matters of religion. Maybe they've given you a gift that isn't good and you don't care for the gift, or there are various inferiorities. You might think you're better than they are. And therefore, since you have to keep the peace and not create conflict with people, when you don't have any other options, you should just tell them you like the gift, tell them you regard them as equals, that you respect their religious views, keep the peace. It's an interesting interpretation of Hobbes. It gets even more interesting if you couple it with a remark by Edwin Curley. So Hobbes was frequently accused of being an atheist. Spinoza accused Hobbes of being an atheist. Spinoza himself was accused of being atheist quite a bit. So Curley, though, is being very careful about this, and he's not just trying to make other people feel bad or get them in trouble. And he through a lot of careful reasoning, he thinks that Hobbes was probably an atheist. And he has a whole article on how you're supposed to read Hobbes in this kind of guarded way. Now, if you were to combine a touch of Frost with the Curley thesis, you might get the thesis, the outcome, the conclusion that Hobbes may have felt obliged to tell the lie that he was a Christian. That would be kind of surprising. But the idea there is you'd be thinking, well, Hobbes thinks he's just doing what he ought to do. I think a less controversial case of attributing obligatory lies is to take the Utilitarians. They're pretty forthright. After all, they're defining a right action as the one that's maximizing good consequences. They don't really pay much attention to the type of action that's being done, whether it's adultery or it is, Sabbath breaking or lying or stealing or whatever. What matters is the consequences. So the fact that perhaps that something is torture, utilitarian has an open mind. Maybe there are conditions under which torture is going to lead to the best consequences. Then torture away, then you are obliged to torture. They may empirically think that's tends to be pretty uncommon, or they don't think it's going to happen, but nevertheless, they have an open mind. The type of action doesn't settle anything. They are not deontologists. Now, the examples that they give of obligatory lying involve generally a prevention of a catastrophe. These are kind of boring examples. A lot of people actually, if you had a catastrophic enough, they would go this way. The utilitarian is committed to something much bolder than that. All the consequences just have to be slightly better. So you got to calculate in, of course, the general injury to the practice of testimony that's incurred by lying and so forth. That's got to be calculated in as well. All the consequences have to be calculated in there. Okay. So, but that's what's surprising. Oh, it has to be like a little bit better. Let's apply it. So that's Derek Parfit, and he's entertaining a child. He can be pretty entertaining to adults as well. Here's the beginning of his book, Reasons and Persons. Like my cat, I often simply do what I want to do. Pleasant, wacky little sentence there. Here's the fact. Parfit did not own a cat. His biographer points this out. The biographer notes, for a leading moral philosopher to begin a major work of moral philosophy with a half-lie was obviously short of ideal. Well, not obvious to me. Lying can be ideal for a utilitarian. Think of it. He's got this wacky opening, and look at all the good consequences. The sentence itself is a pleasure to read. People say, give me more. They want more pleasure. And they read more deeply into the book. It's a demanding book. And they absorb many important true beliefs. And I think of what's on the other side of this equation. The mistaken belief that Parfit has a cat. That's just harmless error. So that was a good deal. Good trade-off. According to utilitarian. Okay. Now, there could be a more scholarly application, one that would have more bearing on how you're supposed to interpret people. And these are the ones that we're mostly interested in. David Hume, he doesn't sign on to utilitarianism in any kind of explicit way, but he kind of tells you that it's a human kind of picture that our action is right when an ideal, sympathetic judge would approve the action. Ideal in the sense that he knows all the relevant facts, and that he's not in a sour mood, and he's got the right kind of he's a healthy person, and he's kind of got all the emotions firing up appropriately. And then what would this judge say in this case? Now, when you look into what the judge is paying attention to, one of the things you notice is this judge is rational. This judge, and this means for you that he's going to focus on secular consequences, not supernatural consequences alleged by clergy and theologians. This judge is not bringing in the afterlife and other kinds of things like this. He's just focused pretty concretely on what's going to happen. If you go to Hume's private correspondence, in which he writes more freely, one of his correspondences discussing this clergyman he knows. I think it's a Mr. Vivian, and Mr. Vivian has lost his faith, but he wonders whether they can continue to preach. And so this is a standard problem discussed by many people, including Immanuel Kant, and they give verdicts on this. Hume is really quite forthright, at least at letter writing. He says, you don't have to be honest with deluded people, that is, the people in his congregation, or with those intolerant of disagreement. They're not owed truth-telling. If they're being flexible, tolerant people, but if they just can't take the truth and so forth, well, you're not obliged to suffer because of their irrationalities and their poor tempers. Right? So Hume sees a lot of advantages, actually, just having a non-believer at the pulpit. They're less likely to be fanatical, for example. If you were to replace them by a true believer in the pulpit, you could get more dangerous religious superstition being spread. Now, if you look at Hume's writings, they're a bit more cautious, and they're also more inconsistent because he'll be arguing away, showing there are problems with various religious arguments, and then he'll go on and he'll profess his simple Christian faith. And the simple Christian faith doesn't need any supplement by argument. So maybe that's supposed to be the explanation why he is knocking down argument after argument. Well, that sentence just sort of lands in a nice quotable part of the essay. It doesn't kind of fit in or anything, but you could see that Hume's lawyer would be, he'd be much appreciative of such a sentence he could quote in court. Hume has met his lawyers halfway, and he is interested in creating a certain amount of uncertainty among some people. All right, so it could be, though I've already kind of slanted a certain way, I'm thinking, Hume is worried about being persecuted. He's in Scotland, after all, and it's the Scottish Enlightenment and so forth, but there's still laws against a lot of the things he's actually doing. So we think that he's lying to avoid charges of impiety. It's a kind of lie in which you hope some people see through the lie, and other people don't see through the lie. That's the maneuver. So when you're lying, it's not always the case you want everybody to understand that, to be fooled by it. Sometimes you want some people not to be fooled. You've got a mixed audience. Hume commentators start using the term irony. This strikes me as just a euphemism for the most part. What irony is supposed to be is that the speaker intends his hearers to recognize that he's flouting the conversational maxim, say what is true. He just says something that's blatantly false, and you're supposed to infer that the opposite or something like that, say in sarcasm. That's irony. Everybody's on board. Everybody's tuned in. But you're not flouting the maxim if you intend some hearers to think one is following the maxim. If that's the point, then you are deceiving them. And so what you've got is just artful lying. And so that seems to be what's really going on. And to describe this as irony is distorting. Now, a little bit more history. Poor David Hume, as a young man, works himself to nearest exhaustion, completing the treatise, and then is very disappointed by the reception. Mostly people are not paying attention, and the ones who are paying attention are seeing a bunch of saucy and incautious things in there, and suggestive that this David Hume fellow is really an atheist. And so Hume has not really covered himself very well here. He's covered himself a bit, but not as well. And this is really kind of spoiling his hopes for being an academic. He tries, But for example, in Edinburgh, you applied there, and the few people who are sort of reading this stuff carefully, they're saying, look, you just can't hire this guy in as a professor. The professors are supposed to be shepherding along the students in their spiritual development and so forth. He's the wrong person for this job. David Hume's friend, incidentally, Adam Smith had to lead prayers. You pray before you learn, and he did not care for this, Adam Smith, and so he asked to be relieved of this. Denied, he must do this, and so that's what he would do. So it was a kind of a different role. I don't have to do this. I don't have to lead any prayers at the University of Texas at Austin. Indeed, I'd probably get into some trouble if I did try to lead some prayers. Okay, so even if I thought they were really effective in getting these students to learn. Okay. So what Hume does is he writes polite essays, and he starts to slowly build up his audience. He starts to sell books. He becomes an historian, an eminent historian, and he writes a history of England, and he makes his living from the bookshops and from becoming a librarian and a few other odd jobs as he picked up. And he winds up doing pretty well. He knows how to sell books. He's one of the first people that can do that. Very impressive. Now, toward the end of his life, we're now reaching 1775, he asks for an advertisement to be inserted, and it says that you should rely solely on the inquiry, which is this it seems like a kind of a second edition of the treatise, one that has been polished up and so forth, but that's how it seems. And so we're supposed to ignore the treatise. And the publisher agreed to insert it even in the future editions of the treatise for people who persistently buy this thing, that you're supposed to heed the inquiry. All right. Now, what are we to do with this? Hume is telling us in the advertisement to ignore the early work and presenting it as was juvenilia. Well, if it's juvenilia, it's very good juvenilia. It's excellent philosophy. So people do read it, and it's controversial. So I have a colleague, Galen Strawson, and he says you're obliged to take Hume at his word and to focus on the inquiry. Maybe you could consult the treatise if there was like a gap or something like that, but that's about it. So one book would have eclipsed the other book, and he thinks it's sort of a scholarly duty to only pay attention to the inquiry. And I guess you could just only make very light and supplemental use of the treatise or something. All right. That's, I think, not the common view amongst the Hume scholars. Most of them are as skeptical as I about substantive differences. The advertisement, I think, this is my view, I'm not attributing this to these other scholars, but here's my view. I think he wants to sell books. So you buy my new edition rather than the old edition, which you can get on the used book market. Right? If you're a college student, you notice you've been buying books, and it's the 5th edition, 6th edition. Ooh, so many editions. Have they really been improving it each edition? I don't know. They have not. They have. There's some small cosmetic changes, and what they're doing, they're forcing you to buy a new book when you could have gotten by in the used book market, and you could buy an old book. So this is an old game that continues. Okay, and Hume was on the early end of the game. And Hume was very flexible in his selling of books. When the treatise wasn't selling well, Hume exaggerates a bit, and he says that the treatise fell dead-born from the press. It wasn't quite that severe. But he was driven to write fake book reviews of his own book to drum up interest. So he made very modest progress in that project. So most Hume scholars just ignore the advertisement. And many go on and they deny there are any substantive differences. They cite remarks, indeed, from Hume himself that seems to concede that the difference is only expository. So here we have an example where treating Hume's claims in the advertisement, it's basically a lie to sell books, yields dividends. It tells you what to read. Keep on reading the treatise, as you can also read the inquiry, but don't put away your copy of the treatise. Don't demote it. It's an important book. Okay. You get to Kant, and the reverse has happened. He wrote this book, Critique of Pure Reason, and then what he does is he gets a second edition, and he insists that it just is basically content-wise the same thing. It's just that he's improved the exposition. Right? So he denies that he changed his mind. So that means that anything in the first edition, called the A edition, has got to be consistent with the B edition, the second edition. But as you're reading along, there actually are many substantive differences. Kant has been, he made some changes, and they're mostly improvements. They're mostly good changes. So what's going on? So he's deviated from the normal thing here, which is to try to sell more books by saying, you've improved. My new and improved edition. He's not saying it's just, packaged differently. That's what he's saying. Okay. So why would he do this? Why would he forego the money advantages? Okay, so here's the idea. First of all, Kant is okay about admitting mistakes before the Critique of Pure Reason. You get the impression that he was just lost interest in his early work. It's wrong. It's just this pre-critical writing. It's just wrong, and he's just sort of he doesn't entice people to read more of that stuff. That's entirely eclipsed by this new revolutionary critical philosophy. So this is a decisive breakthrough, the Critique of Pure Reason. He likes the analogy with an organism, that one way to tell that the organism has got all its parts and they're all in the proper place is whether the organism is alive and flourishing there. If you're missing a liver, you're not going to be alive and flourishing. So the Critique of Pure Reason is like this organism, and so you can judge holistically that it is complete and correct. Okay. I don't have the same biology that Kant has, and what I like is the analogy that epistemologists love so much, the jigsaw puzzles. And I wish he'd used this one. Because look at, once you fit the last piece of a jigsaw puzzle in, every element is correctly placed, and there is no room for any further element. It's complete. It's consistent. It's complete. You judge it holistically. Right? Putting the pieces together is very complicated, but once you how do you know you did it all right? Well, did that last piece fit? Bingo, it's done. Similarly, take the combination of a lock. It's very difficult to open. Now you keep on, the safecracker keeps on going at it, and then he claims he has the correct combination. But then you say, well, that's a very complicated business. How am I to know it's the correct combination? Well, he dials it in, and the lock opens. Boom, that guy's right? So although it's very hard to get to the solution, it's easy to verify that the solution is consistent and complete. That's why you should trust the Critique of Pure Reason. Right? Now, when he publishes it, he expects people to fall in line and to look at it as you would that completed jigsaw puzzle, but that is not what happens. They are, many are just baffled, and they claim to find errors, and he was very angry about that. And So what do you do when people start misinterpreting a book and they don't get it? Well, you continue to write some more. He tries, he writes the prolegomena to any future metaphysics. He's just spelling out why metaphysics is dead, 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 and he's adds in defense of his the critique of pure reason. He just dares his opponents to find any of the antinomies to be invalid. So the antinomies are an important part of this book. A very attractive stage of the book, where you see the best arguments for empiricism and rationalism pitted against each other in a clash of giants there. And he says that the arguments are, each of them impeccable as long as you are going along a certain shared presupposition of the empiricists and the rationalists. And, basically the idea that these kind of the principles that are applying to phenomenal reality are generalized to numinal reality, things in themselves. That's the basic thing. You got to spell all that out. But he says that none of the arguments are invalid. That's the claim. Okay, so now what he wants to do is come up with I think at first just a clearer edition, but as he's doing this, he's writing that a clearer edition, and he's listening to other people. I think he comes to believe there were indeed mistakes in that first edition. Admitting the mistakes would have made him look foolish in his reaction to the book reviewers. Those errors would also undermine his holistic argument for accepting the critique of pure reason. The analogy with an open, the lock or the organism or the jigsaw puzzle. All those would be spoiled. You'd need this open mind about the critique of pure reason. Well, that was very complicated. How do I know it's consistent and complete? That's a tough one, because now you lost your holistic rationale. All right, so in the article, Ian Proops, an eminent Kant scholar, recently wrote a book on the critique of pure reason, and we start going through substantive changes. So in sketch form, the analogies of experience, we start there. First edition commits him to the permanence of the soul, while the second gingerly avoids this. Criticism of the first paralogism. The first edition says the argument is sound but trivial. The second says it equivocates on its middle term. Criticism of the second paralogism. The first edition says a crucial premise is not known, and the second instead says the argument is trivial. Fourth paralogism. The first says the dogmatic rational psychologist commits to the epistemic thesis that we cannot be certain of external objects. The second says the thesis is metaphysical. I can exist without a body. These are all pretty important changes here, and so what's going on? There's these important changes. You want more? Read Ian Proops' book. He has more, and they are discussed at a more leisurely rate than in the article. It's a pretty long sequence of changes. It seems like an attribution of lying is appropriate here. So if the reader believes the two editions are equivalent, I thought they would, then he'd be unable to consistently read the two editions. So there I am thinking, I don't understand this. I can't make sense. I can't reconcile stuff about the soul, for example. Maybe I'm not so smart. I'm not so rational. I blame myself. So you'd have to be attributing shortcomings to the readers, and many readers do this. They cannot square it up, and so maybe I'm not on the ball. I'm illogical, So you're not really being. So the problem is under that interpretation, if you think that they really are equivalent, then the readers are you're not being charitable to readers. Now you might say, well, maybe Kant missed it. He was making mistakes. He wasn't lying. He just didn't realize that these were substantive differences. Well, that's not too charitable either, because you'd be attributing obtuseness to the author. And he's quite good at philosophy and quite good at this critique of pure reason business. So you don't like that idea either. He's just blundering along, So now might one say, oh, he was just lying to himself about the equivalence. Well, that doesn't help it at all, I think, because now he's still a liar, and further, he's a very bad kind of liar on his own terms. He thinks that lying to yourself is extremely dangerous because you can't tell whether you're following your conscience. Your conscience is speaking to you pretty clearly, but if you start to, put noise into the channel there and deceive yourself and so forth, well, then you start misbehaving. And so you really poison the well there. So don't lie to yourself. It's particularly dangerous. It's kind of the root of all evil, lying to yourself. Because your conscience is there to set you up kind of nicely to do the right thing. It's lying to yourself is just terrible. Lies are just terrible. Okay. Now, but really, how serious is he about this? Now, when you look at his biography, it seems to me it's just a biography of kind of a typical kind of Prussian professor. He's a very successful Prussian professor, but he doesn't seem to be any more averse to lying than other Prussian professors. So one thing that will get these professors a bit devious is graduation ceremonies. They'll try to slip out in various ways. The professors were supposed to go into church, at least for graduation ceremonies. Kant would go along, marching along, but when it was time to kind of enter the church, he would duck out. He didn't actually go in. He didn't like going to church. He found it repellent. The people are too obsequious during the ceremony. What he was called crawling, it's as if you're having to placate a bully, So he really found that pretty uncomfortable, and didn't like it. Now, as he had, he would have to participate in faculty government, so he had played the role of rector, and then you're really got to go there because you're not your main person. And then, but he would then say, "Oh, I'm indisposed." He did this repeatedly, so his health wasn't that great, sure, but that's a lot of very conveniently timed illnesses. Okay, so just a sort of typical professor situation where the professors will start to lie. It's like, hey, he lied there. All right. Here's another thing. You want to get these professors to lie. Have them dealing with censors. The professors do not like to be censored. And so this is a good area to look in for lies. One thing that you might see to surprise you is the amount of censorship he did accept. So he was okay with people censoring his lectures to students, impressionable students, fine. Or censoring the clergy, fine. But what you can't do is censor his communication with fellow scholars. So in this important essay, when he's answering this question, what is enlightenment? It's basically the process of curbing your willful immaturity. You need to grow up, and people don't want to grow up. And so you can start to get them to follow leaders who will just try to make them into sheep and so forth. It's a pretty dangerous social process. It will interfere with this duty to develop your gifts, to develop yourself. So one of the things, but he's accepting a lot of these limits. But he says there shouldn't be a limit for freedom of the pen. So when you're writing for the Republic of Letters there, amongst these other scholars, you should be able to say what you believe. You don't have to say what the church requires you to say, or what the government. For this one area, you have to have freedom of speech. You need it for personal development and for social progress. So this was the one that Kant would defend quite courageously. This is, I think, a pretty admirable episode. So he, during Frederick the Great's realm, Frederick the Great was an irreligious person, and he did allow basically for freedom of the pen, and he was encouraged and complimented by Kant on this. Now, when his nephew, King Wilhelm, took over, then things changed because they wanted to go back to the old censoring of even the scholarly work. They were very concerned about the Enlightenment. They associated it with the French Revolution. They saw it as an important threat, not only to the political leaders, but to the spiritual welfare of their subjects. Okay. So, but what Kant would do is he would circumvent the censorship of religious writings. And so one of the dodges, they would like different tracks of censorship, depending on whether it was a philosophy work or if it's theology. And what he did is he channeled it so that it was going to be judged as philosophy, which was, more lighter restrictions than if it was theology stuff and biblical stuff. And so he did a run around, and then he did publish this stuff. And then the king and his ministers, who they were really angry, and it looks like Kant was kind of making a fool out of them, by doing an end around on the censorship. So they write a rude letter to Kant, scolding him and threatening him with unpleasant measures. And so Kant realizes, and other people they've already been fleeing, to different universities, and they've already, been getting into trouble. Now it is Kant's turn, and Kant is a leading figure, so it's going to be pretty interesting in what Kant does. So one of the things that Kant does is he starts saying that the stuff that he wrote made no appraisal of Christianity. That is quite implausible. Lawrence Pasternak itemizes the appraisals in this enlightening essay. So I think he's lying there. That made no appraisal. He jolly well did make an appraisal, and they were interesting appraisals. They're still discussed quite intensely by people who are interested in the relationship between him and Christianity. Okay, so what Kant does, though, after he says that, he still says, "Well, I didn't do anything wrong, but just to be on the safe side, he composes this looks like a complete capitulation to the king's demands." He says, what's written there, "I find that as your majesty's loyal subject, in order not to fall under suspicion, it will be the surest course for me to abstain entirely from all public lectures on religious topics, whether on natural or revealed religion, and from not only from lectures, but also from publications. I hereby promise this." Boom. That was in writing. Now, we only have a draft of this letter. I suspect that the original was destroyed during World War II. There was a lot of bombing going on then. So all I'm saying is, given this matches what was in the original, this is what's going on. Okay, so that looks like Kant gives up, and some of his friends are disappointed. That it looks like he's been pretty courageous, and now he's kind of reached his limit. Kant was, he was in a position where he could have lost his job, but he was a pretty good investor of his funds. He could have continued on, quietly living off of his investments, despite the fact that it was pretty impressive financially. He came up from nothing. I mean, he was the the son of a harness maker, and he just worked his way up from the bottom to kind of the top of Königsberg's royal set there. So he was very impressive socially. So, okay, it looks like that's, so, and the king and the minister, they're delighted. They are now looking good. They put Kant in his place. He's shown himself to be contrite. Okay. So now what happens is that Kant was hoping that King would die before him. And in his desk is a manuscript waiting to go, along with other essays on religion. He's got a contingency plan. Okay. And then he's got to, he knows it's going to look bad because it's going to look like he breaking his promise once you got the king dead there. But he tries to make it into a positive thing. He portrays himself as, through his careful choice of wording, cleverly avoided a lifetime commitment to refraining from publishing on religion. In particular, he claims that the phrase, as your majesty's loyal subject, tricked the king into falsely believing the promise meant for Kant's lifetime when it was truly limited to the king's lifetime. Okay, so instantly, that's okay. Kant he's okay with misleading people as long as you're telling the truth, so they make false inferences. That's okay. So he just doesn't. You can't just use lying though. That's the delicate distinction he wants to defend. But wait a minute. This phrase, as your majesty's loyal subject, that's really no more of an escape clause than the following in this bet. So I bet you, as a loyal German, that Germany will win more gold medals than France in the year 2024. Okay. Now, suppose that I discover that I'm actually French. Do I get out of the bet? Maybe the person, if they were a good sport or something, or they want, I'll let you out. Maybe have an excuse, or they could be justified, but they don't have to. They can assist. It says, look what's written there. This stuff about your being as a loyal German, that's just what is called a conventional implicature. It's just sort of, it's not at issue content. It's just something clarificatory, extraneous stuff. It is not part of the payout condition for the bet. You got to pay up. Right? Well, similarly, Kant's promise is not affected by the death of the king. You could just, with these phrases like explaining as this or that, you could just ignore those. They're not part of what is the content of the promise. Okay, so now you may not be persuaded, or you want to read more about this. So there is another article where we go through the details of Kant's promise to the king, and there are the details for that one. That's another one forthcoming. So you read on in his account of the episode. So there's the bit, he seems to be lying about the nature of whether it has what he wrote was a real infraction. He says it was no real infraction. Then he's got the promise himself, and then he keeps on writing though. And he starts talking about, like, in the conflict of the faculties. He says that he was reproached by the king simply because, having nothing to hide and not wanting to be accused of using underhanded means, he had followed his usual policy of signing his name to all my writings. Okay. Well, wait a minute. Is that true? Is it so? Censorship is a standard tactic. Anonymity is a standard tactic for getting around censorship. Right? Kant was suspected of this for other works, and so lots of interesting confusions with Fichte. So that incidentally is that Budapest has the statue to the anonymous writer. So you might wonder, who's that a statue of? We began the presentation with the statue of Kant. But maybe this statue is of Kant right there. Here's Here's some evidence. Only 8 years earlier, Kant had indeed failed to sign his name to an anonymous work on the propensity to fanaticism and the means to oppose it. Okay, well, maybe he forgot that one. Okay. Maybe. But he did the same precaution on 9 previous occasions. And they are listed on this website, Stephen Narragun's Kant in the Classroom. And you can see them. That's too many to have forgotten. It was a common thing he was doing. So the basic idea is he's a kind of average aversion to lying. He doesn't like to lie. Neither do most people. Most of these profession professors don't like to do it. Most of them will say that lying is always wrong and so forth. But they did lie. Behaviorally he has ordinary aversion to lying. What's extraordinary is the strength and frequency of the condemnations of lying. He says all lies are grave misdeeds, and he says it over and over and over again emphatically. He rejects the Catholic distinction between venial and mortal sins. So the Catholics say never lie too, but they distinguish between the bad lies, the really bad lies, and ones that are not so bad, venial sins. For instance, Aquinas thinks that you're lying whenever you tell a joke, because in the joke you use you are saying stuff you don't believe. Augustine lets you the joke. He says, Aquinas says it's always a lie, and then but then Aquinas adds it's not such a bad lie. Okay? He kind of sensible distinction. But Kant is rejecting this. He doesn't have this. They're all terrible things. Okay. So, and then Kant famously, he's about 70 or something. Someone has been just discreetly criticizing a certain German professor, philosopher who says you should never lie. But what about, if there's a murderer at the door and the only way to save this person is to lie? Can you lie in that circumstance? That's a very old case, goes back to Augustine, many people saying things. All right, so Kant says, not even in that case. Right? He sends this whole reply, testily, criticizing Benjamin Constant. So if Kant really believed that, he'd be a fanatic, an irrational fanatic, because under those circumstances, if that's the only way I have, I can't do it through silence, and I can't do it, through telling truths that could merely mislead them and so forth. Well, it's lying time, and pretty much all 20th century almost all 20th century philosophers and 21st century philosophers are of that persuasion. Not all of them. Peter Geach says never lie, but wow, he's a real remarkable figure. So this is a pretty big embarrassment for Kant scholars. Very few of them will endorse this very strong conclusion. And we would like to save him from this. Kant is a highly civilized person. He's an effective intellectual. So he's got a little bit more flexibility than he's saying. Now. How do we deal with this situation? Well, think about how Kant handles Voltaire. Voltaire claimed to be universally indifferent to all metaphysical propositions, and yet Voltaire is a deist. He's a determinist, and he's a defender of absolute space. He's getting a lot of this from Isaac Newton. He had quite a bit of admiration for him. So what Kant does in this situation, where someone says, "Oh, I don't care about metaphysics," and yet he's taking all kinds of metaphysical positions, is he charitably reads these partisan, self-proclaimed indifferentists, such as Voltaire, as being really, they are really consistent. They just deny the sincerity of their claims to universal indifference. They merely feign indifference. So they're not, they really have these metaphysical positions, and then they're just, they're kind of lying about being indifferent. Then everything's squared up nicely. Now, Kant is, he's very circumspect. He doesn't quite put it as boldly as I did there, but that's how you have to interpret Voltaire. He's not so stupid as to think that these aren't metaphysical positions. It's just, he's been posturing about his indifference. He wants to be cool, Okay. So, well, let's apply Kant to Kant's strategy to Kant. So he does famously claim to be opposed to all lies. So let's just take a leaf out of his own book. And we are going to try to charitably interpret him, make him out to be consistent, by denying the sincerity of his claim to be universally so opposed. In truth, Kant believed that lying is sometimes permissible, and he was acting on that permission when he denied making substantive changes to the critique, the first critique. So we were in an interpretive dilemma, and this is common if you have these persistent overgeneralizers. Then you what do? You have a dilemma for the principle that people should be interpreted as moral by their own lights. Either we take them at their word and attribute a big moral error, or we postulate a lie and attribute a smaller moral error. Some error has to be attributed, so we charitably attribute smaller error. The concluding picture of Kant. He's an opponent of lying who overstated his opposition. Many parents do this. They think the kid needs some simple rules, and so they say, never lie, never steal, never do this, never do that. And then what happens is that the children, as they're maturing, and often this does not take too long, incidentally, they start noticing their parents do not seem to behave as they are telling, as they're talking. So the children are then in an interesting position with their parents. The children are there kind of realizing that their parents lie about lying. Now, these parents, the parents themselves may realize this, and I think they have an empathic foothold on understanding Kant. Kant really wants to discourage people from lying. It certainly is a dangerous habit to form. What do you do with dangerous habits? I think for some dangerous habits, say like a heroin habit or something like that, here's the thing to do. Don't do it even once. That's good. That's very practical. Foregoing all heroin is a very practical way of going about your life. That's a good never rule. The rule never lie, that's not a very good rule. That's a bad rule because sometimes you have to lie. And so there's a difference between the two. Okay, so what happened is that Kant is trying to treat the lying case as if it was like the heroin case. All right, what you have is there's a complicated picture of Kant, perhaps, but I think that this is the one that is going to be the most charitable. Thank you.